My name is Paul Overland. It's my privilege to be part of the Bible faculty here at Ashland Theological Seminary. We want to welcome you to the Flora Archaeological Collection. So welcome to Archaeology Through the Eyes of a Potter. Special thanks go to Dr. Kenneth Walther, who is in the second table back here. Dr. Walther is Emeritus Professor of New Testament. He is the wisdom behind so much of what you see here. He has shepherded it for decades and added to the collection through his insight. So special thanks to you and to Beth Hoffman, who perhaps will join us later, I'm not sure, who served as your assistant. Altogether, I'm told that this collection houses some 1,200 pieces, not all of which are we able to exhibit. They range from around 4000 BC, and that's especially the items in this first case, going to a Byzantine era that would be in the early Christian era. And our special guest today is Mrs. Julie Ward, her husband Ed. She comes to us as a natural potter, someone who works regularly and has for a long time with clay. Grew up in Suffolk in the UK. You'll notice her accent fairly early on. Met her husband, who was in the U.S. Air Force and apparently was assigned to England at the time. They spent a number of years in Germany, deployed to Germany, and then moved to Ohio, raised family here, currently in Navarre. And I learned today that it's not so much they have a studio attached to their house. They have a house built around the studio. Is that how you explained it, Ed? Which sounds marvelous for an artist. So what happened is a few weeks ago, my wife and I, of all places, in Layman's Hardware, met Julie as she was doing a demo. Now, isn't that ironic? She was at her wheel creating things, and I was thinking about an archaeology class that I'll be offering this fall, and I came alongside and said, what would it be like, ma'am, if you were to look at some artifacts that were from 2,000 to 6,000 years old? And her eyes grew rather large, and she said, that sounds like an amazing opportunity. Maybe splendid was the word you used. I'm
Probably.
Not sure. So can I come? A couple of weeks later, she came. Dr. Byron and I listened as she began to just comment spontaneously on what goes through her mind as a potter when she looks at some of the artifacts. And those artifacts came to life. Here's the dilemma. You see, since around 1890, when Sir Flinders Petrie was in southern Palestine doing exploration at Tel el-Hasi, they realized that by studying changes in the technology of pottery, you could begin to date the levels of habitation, a tell as it's called. So the simpler ones are going to be at the bottom, and as technology like adding a slow or a fast pottery wheel improves the quality of the piece, these are layered. You can date them, but the pieces remain static. It wouldn't be until around 1975 that at another tell, an excavator said, we need to bring on staff someone who is a potter, someone who understands what it takes to make these things. And then the lights begin to turn on because we begin to appreciate the mind, the skill, the fingers that are behind the creation of the pieces that you see here. That's what excited Dr. Byron and myself, and that's why you're here. Here's the flow today. We've selected 5 artifacts. They're right over here behind me, and one by one, we'll bring them on the table. I'll just give like a 45-second overview to say, this is the approximate time frame. This is what we think it was used for, and then we turn it over to Mrs. Ward, and she'll comment on what she sees concerning technology and material and level of skill. After we do that for these 5 pieces, there'll be Q&A time. So be thinking of questions, anything that comes up, questions that come to your mind. And after that, for about 10 minutes of Q&A, we'll push the table back, and she'll push her potter's wheel forward, and she will recreate one of the pieces, make a replica. I am so glad that you're here. Thank you for doing this. Ed, thank you for coming. Some may be wondering, when did pottery start? In Jordan, they found pottery as early as 6,000 BC. So started back then. When did they start bringing on the wheel to make a little more higher grade material? And we understand that the slow wheel came around 2000 BC. If you're Thinking biblical history, I think of Abraham as being around 1800 BC. So a couple hundred years before Abraham, somebody came up with a slow wheel. A little bit later, a faster wheel with smoother operation. Things like slip, the coating, the fine coating, which you see on some of our pieces, came later, actually around 3000 BC. Correction there. And glazing came around 900 BC, adding that kind of glassy in color. So kilns were, as early as I see here, Susa in southwestern Iran in 6000 BC, achieving 800 degrees centigrade, 1472 degrees Fahrenheit. I knew you needed that detail, so there you go. So those are some of the areas of technology. Here we go. Let's get started. Here's the first piece that we'd like to comment on. All right, what we have first of all is a piece from the Chalcolithic, think copper, Chalcolithic era, dated probably around 4000 BC. Maybe domestic, food service. If you're able to get a close-up look, you'll see is there a technical term for these decorations? I don't know.
Dip-dobs?
Yeah, what she said. That works for me. Yeah.
Nobbles. Let's call them nobbles.
All right. Maybe food service, maybe ceremonial. So what goes through your mind, Julie, as you look at this?
The first thing that goes through my mind is I can't believe that I'm this close to something this old.
You're not referring to me, I trust.
No, absolutely not. We're not very far apart. The second thing that I would say is immediately apparent to me is that I doubt that it was made on a potter's wheel. The reason being, although I have made things that were slightly wonky on a potter's wheel, but generally somebody that would be throwing things for use in a home or for use to carry, to set on a table, something, they would be making more than one. It would be something that they did. They wouldn't be, I wouldn't imagine they would be somebody who just thought, I need a bowl, I'll make a bowl. Because there's a little bit more to the knowledge they might need. So my immediate thoughts of this is that it probably wasn't made on a wheel. Knowing what I know now about the age of it,
that would fit then.
It would fit. That would be the immediate thing I would think. The other thing that would give that away would be the little knobbles, because the little knobbles would immediately make me think this is at least two pieces. This is a piece that has been made, the shallow piece, and then the rim that goes on top would have probably been made as a strip and joined around the edges with either a tiny tool or by fingers. It almost makes me think of a pie crust, the way that my grandmother would go around the edges of a pie crust to join the edges of the pie crust together. And she always made it look so pretty. And I think to myself, that's what this makes me think of. It makes me think of a pie crust, of two pieces of something soft that have been squeezed together. The next thing I think of immediately is that we can see the joining area on the outside, but we can't see it on the inside. So there would have been, my thinking for that would be, I want it to be watertight. I don't want anything that I might put inside it to leak out where I made the little joins. So I would smooth the inside of it. That would also make it easier to clean. So having seen, could you flip it over for me?
Right. Sure.
I'm absolutely not touching anything.
Some might just want, if you can see what she's talking about, the more vertical
Yeah.
edges and then the seam here. Okay. So there we are.
Then I look at the bottom of it and I think, this is very round, very nicely round, but it's not round enough to have been thrown on a wheel and taken off of a wheel. It's been, I almost feel like it was smoothed over something. A sheet of clay may have been, we call it a slump or a hump mold, depending on whether something slumps down into it or whether it's you know, whether it's convex or concave, you can lay a piece of clay over something to make it domed. And then if I made a dish and I used a hump mold, I would lay a piece of clay over it. And then I would roll a little sausage of clay, put it around here to make a foot so that when I turn my dish over, it has a solid base to stand on. And we still do that today. When I do sometimes use hump molds, although I primarily throw on the wheel, I always will put a little foot, a ring around the bottom to keep whatever it is from wobbling. And it also helps it not to warp as it dries. It gives it a firm footing. So my take is that it was made with a rim joined to something that was made either in a concave shape of some sort or over a convex shape of some sort, and that it probably had the foot put on afterwards.
Any thoughts about the texture, the material, or is it the fabric? Anything stand out there?
Knowing how old it is, the fineness of the clay is almost, it's overwhelming, because the place I get my clay from, they make 20 different sorts of clay. And I'm very particular about the sort of clay I get from them. I don't like a gritty clay. I like a smooth, elastic clay, because I make smaller things, and that works nicely for smaller things, and because I've had my shoulder remade and it doesn't like hard work. This clay, if I imagine digging clay out of the ground and wedging it, if you can imagine kneading bread, we never use a piece of clay without kneading it. And that helps. Clay, the particles of clay are a little, almost like a flat grain of rice. They're little elongated discs. When we wedge clay, it helps to get them all kind of heading in the same direction. And that makes the clay stronger when it's made into something, and easier to work with when it's made into something, and less likely to fall apart when we cook or fire it. And knowing that they fired at 800 degrees, probably. Yes. I fire now at my final firings are at 2,200 and something degrees. So my first firing is at about 1900 degrees. So they were reaching incredible temperatures for what they were making and processing their clay beautifully. I can buy clay to use at the moment for making larger pieces that need more solidity and more ability to hold their own weight. I can buy clay now that's a lot grittier than this and a lot heavier than this, and we call it grog. We call it groggy, the particles that are put into a clay to give it structure, to help it maintain its weight as we make things, maintain its shape rather. So, but this is quite fine clay.
Let's look at the next piece.
It's beautiful.
See what we see there.
It's a stunning little
Didn't see it.
special
You can
thing.
come back later and look at them in the case, but that's item one.
Would you name it?
What would we name this? Dr. Walther? Is this
I just call it decorative bowl from the Chalcolithic period.
what
It's
Dr. Walther
beautiful.
said? Decorative bowl from the
That's how those
Chalcolithic.
little beads are around.
Yes.
Beads.
Yes.
There we go.
Decoration.
We'll call them beads and not novels.
Right. Right.
And it's really important to think about that and think they were decorative and they were meant to be decorative, or they would have been smooth like the inside of the bowl was smooth. This is amazing.
By the way, I believe we've got some photocopies. What we have here from a particular textbook is an actual figurine of an Egyptian potter. Dates, did it say 2200 BC? I forget. So you might want to picture this sort of a character in the process of making the pieces we're looking at. All right, so what have we got here? This picture dates, we're told, to the Middle Bronze. What does that mean? 1925 to 1550 BC. Again, biblical connection, think of Abraham and Sarah, maybe around 1800 to 2000 BC. 1550, we're approaching the early date proposed for the Exodus, things of that sort. So not yet has, my goodness, maybe Joshua is going to come on the scene in a bit. Some would put Joshua a few centuries later. Certainly we're way ahead of Samuel and Saul and David with this particular piece. So probably a small volume beverage container, something of that sort. So what goes through your mind, Julie?
Again, the clay. I'm amazed by the clay. And as I've looked at some of the other things that we have, I'm beginning to realize that the larger things are made from a grittier, groggier clay. Makes perfect sense. That's what I would do if I was building something big or making something big. It would be more building, as we've discussed, rather than probably throwing. Those clays tend to be groggier. This is a finer clay. And it's when you look at how far back this came from, it's no different from the fine clay that I would use today. It's stunning. It's lovely. And something else that I was saying was I find it very hard to make something with a spout and not tip the spout downwards. But the people that made this, they understood things that I've found out by mistake. I found out that if I make a spout that tips downwards after I've poured my whatever, the thing sits there and drips. And I was saying about when I make teapots, my spouts have to be in a very particular place, because if they lean over too far, I can't fill the teapot up to the top or as high as I want to. And if it leans over too far after I've poured, it drips. These things were very, very obviously to me made not to drip after they've been poured, because they've stayed fairly level on top and they haven't tipped the spout down. And that makes perfect sense, because you don't want drippiness. So that's one of the things that comes to me immediately. The other thing that comes to me immediately is I've always wondered if the body was made and then the neck would have been added afterwards. But then I threw some of these to get a feel. It pretty much is a vase. It's what I would throw with a vase, except for it has a pointy bottom. When they made this on a wheel, possibly with its age.
Yes, that's conceivable. What do you think?
So that brings up some questions. The neck and the spout makes sense for it to have been thrown on a wheel, because I would throw a round neck. I would throw a vase with a round neck. And then while it was still very, very soft, I'd squash this. And you've got a spout. Very simple, very straightforward. And that's what I feel sure they've done here. They've made something with a circle, and that's still how we make spouts today. Nothing has changed. Nothing. I was saying earlier that I've been very guilty of looking back and feeling like people in way back in history and in antiquity were a little bit stupid and simple. And as I've been here and as I've looked at these things and as I've thought about the ways they were made compared to the ways I make things today, they were brilliant. They've figured out things that I've just figured out by trial and error, and that's exactly the same way they figured them out. And so the spout, if the drink is cool, the spout helps to keep the cool in. If we have a wide-necked something, I make my cups with a belly and a narrow top, because if I put a hot drink in it, the narrower top keeps the drink hot. If I have a wide-necked something, it lets the heat out. I'm kind of wondering if that works in reverse with keeping things cold or cool, which would have made sense. So the handle would have been added at the end of the whole process. When it's very, very hard to make something that's this thin-walled and put a handle on immediately when you make it.
Help people see that.
Sorry, I'm not touching anything.
Okay. Later you can come up. It is relatively.
It's very
I'm thinking
fine.
like a quarter inch.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
taken me years to be able to throw things that fine
Yeah.
that I don't ruin and that I don't bend in the wrong directions and that make it through the drying process. So it would have been thrown. Then the spout would have been, the circle would have been held, smushed. Then, I'm sure I could find a better word than smushed.
That sounds
Sorry
very
about that.
technical to me.
Then I would roll a little sausage, make a handle shape, flatten it down a little bit, make a handle shape that what I would actually do is make a little sausage and hold it on this side for you, and that would give me the angle to cut it here and the angle to cut it here. I would then set both pieces aside to dry, because while it's bendy, you can't join them together. You ruin the shape of what you've made.
Okay.
You set both to dry until they feel like leather. Then you make this surface a little bit wet and you rough it up. The little handle surface a little bit wet and you rough it up. You have to know that they have to be the same moisture content when you join them together, because if they're not, as they dry, they'll pull each other apart. So the handle, I would probably make my item, and then after that's dried for a little while, I'll make my handle, because my handle's going to dry a little bit faster. When they both reach the same moisture content, I know I can join them together. They can't be too dry, because I use liquid to join them together. A liquid clay, a very wet, soggy liquid clay. Now, if I make 20 cups, I can cover them in plastic if they're about dry enough while I make my handles and make sure my handles are the right moisture content. What did they do? Did they have somebody that made all the handles? Did they have somebody that made all of the pots and made the necks and set them aside while somebody else was making lots and lots of handles? Did they do it on a production line? They obviously made lots of these because by the shape of it, they really knew what they were doing.
Can I add something about production that
Yes,
you might be
for sure.
fascinated by? In the process of getting ready for today, I kind of beefed up my research and learned that between Tyre and Sidon on the Phoenician coast, there's a town called Zarephath. People familiar with the prophet Elijah will know that when God brought a famine, a dearth, at one point he sent Elijah to be cared for by the widow in Zarephath. At that town, archaeologists have found, they've uncovered 22 kilns, and the archaeologists estimate that there probably, if they uncovered all there probably around 100 kilns. So there was a pottery production of staggering proportions that dates from about this era. We're not saying this piece comes from there, but they say from around the 15th century to the 7th century BC. So your question about were
incredible.
they making in production? Yes.
That far back.
Yeah.
So when I make 20 cups, I make 20 cups. They sit and dry a little bit. I make 20 handles, or I do my handles a little bit differently, but I make all my handles. I set my handles to dry. I watch them both very carefully. If the handles dry out a bit too quickly, I wrap them in plastic. But they both need to be the same moisture content. How did they do that when they didn't have plastic sheeting? They couldn't have put a wet cloth over it, because a wet cloth would make the clay mush. You can't construct something and then put something wet over it, because the clay will start to degrade. So did they have a little tent that was kept moist? How was that done?
Now you can see why Dr. Byner and I were just intrigued by the insights. Let's move to the next piece.
Can I just say something about the
By all
pointy
means.
bit? Just
Go right
real
ahead.
quick about, oh, I'm sorry.
Why is it pointed at the bottom instead of flat?
Why is it pointed at the bottom instead of flat?
Well, Dr. Waltherwood encourages us to consider that this may indicate nomadic use, right?
Yeah.
That if I am not in a culture with tables, but rather I'm sitting on rugs and I have a fairly stout tent because I'm Bedouin type, I'm nomadic, then it's very easy for me to put this in the sand. Is that the right idea, Dr. Walther? Yeah,
It makes
that's
perfect
what we believe.
sense.
So it serves better in that culture than having a flat bottom mug as we would be used to. Yeah, was there something else you wanted to comment on?
The thing I was thinking about as well, if this was made on a potter's wheel, I can't throw something that's that narrow at the bottom and bring it out in a bulbous pear shape that we were talking about, and then bring it in and then bring it out and then make a spout. It's not possible for me to do that on the wheel with such a narrow base. That leads me to think that they made them chunky at the bottom, but without a wide base on the inside. So they made them chunky at the bottom, but brought it up in a conical shape. As that dries, that has to be trimmed off. If that thickness of clay at the bottom and the thinness of clay at the top were left to dry by itself, number one, you wouldn't be able to shave that clay off later because you'd end up breaking the piece. Or if it was very, very thick at the bottom and very, very thin at the top, as it dried, it would tear itself to pieces because it would dry at different rates. The thinner clay would dry more quickly, thicker clay dry more slowly. You'd get cracks, it would fall to pieces. So at the point that it would have been beginning to be leather dry and they put the handle on, it would have been sturdy enough. Or I wonder if it would have been sturdy enough for them to have tipped it over. I have a chuck on my wheel that is a tube. So I can turn something that's narrow that can't stand on its top, a little vase, I can turn it over and sit it in this conical thingy, and I can trim the bottom off a little bit. So is that how they made the bottoms?
You know better than I.
I know how I would do it. I'm not saying, I'm beginning to think they were a lot smarter than we are. So interesting. Sorry. I do love the thought of the things that were conical at the bottom being that way for a reason and being that way for a nomadic lifestyle. And I'm thinking next time I go to the beach, I'm taking something that's conical at the bottom to stick in the sand.
So here we have what we call a chalice. Let me just raise it so that people might be able to see it a little more easily. We expect this dates to Iron Age 1, around 1200 BC, down to 1000 BC. So we're in the time frame of Samuel and Saul and David and getting down into Solomon. We suppose this is a little bit too fancy for typical residential use, probably ceremonial, perhaps for libations, perhaps for something of a ceremonial or a religious sort. So there we are. What goes through your mind?
The first thing, when I came here the first time, when I saw this, my immediate thought was why? Why put it on a pedestal? My next thought was, if this were for drinking, when I make my cups, I tip even if I make a ball cup that looks like a little ball, a belly, if I belly my cups out, I do bring the tops in to keep the heat into the drink, but then I do just tip the tops out a little bit. The reason for that is as I put something to my mouth, it wants to feel right. It wants to feel like it wants to put the liquid in my mouth and not down my shirt. So I will make a very slight, gentle curve outwards. You don't have to. It just feels nice. And it's less likely to end up on me and more likely to end up in me, the contents of the thing. That's what makes me think that made me question, why has this got a rim? Because you could drink out of it, but with a rim this thick, if I tried to drink out of it, the curvature of this would mean that it would spill. So maybe they had big mouths. I don't know. Maybe they drunk thick, gooey liquids. Who knows? That made me think that I wouldn't make it like this for drinking. But if I made this for fruit, or to serve food, or I wouldn't get very much food in it. It's kind of little. So the other thing I said immediately when I came here the first time was, oh, this was made in 2 pieces. And if you look underneath it, you'll see that it's hollow, which he then did. So all this did for me was throw loads and loads of questions in my path. I would throw this in 2 pieces. I'd make my bottom, set it aside. Again, I'd throw a little bowl, tip the rim out a little bit while I was at the end of throwing it. 2 pieces. Again, they have to dry a little bit. I can't put them together at that state because this will... And the bowl part would lose its shape. It wouldn't be able to maintain its integrity. So I set those aside. They'll dry a little bit. I make up my glue, my very liquidy, watery, dusty clay, stick them together. But they have to be at the right moisture content to do so, which means they have to be thrown at almost the same thickness. I couldn't make a solid one of these and put a concave bowl on top of a thinner wall because they would tear each other to pieces as they dried. They wouldn't survive, and if they survived the drying, they probably wouldn't survive the kiln. The environment in the kiln, the condition in the kilns are quite violent as far as the clay goes, because my clay that I use shrinks by 11%, and I know that when I fire it. It's already shrunk a little bit before it goes in the kiln because it has to be bone dry before I fire it. So I lose about 11% of whatever I make. To me, it feels completely bone dry when I put it in the kiln. But while it's in the kiln, it shrinks more because more moisture comes out of it. So it has to have been made in 2 pieces, unless this potter was absolutely unbelievable. If I made a chalice, I would make it taller. I'm thinking a communion cup, you know, when we used to pass the communion cup around, which apparently is deadly to do now. So did it have a different ceremonial use?
Perhaps so. Any thoughts about the material it's made
The
of?
clay is gorgeous, is a little bit rougher than the clay of the other things we looked at, which makes me think, normally clays, the colours of clays are fairly specific to the area that they're harvested from. The area I come from in England is it's a clay basin. It has a beautiful deep red clay that almost looks like terracotta. Different areas would have had different coloured clays. So, and it's very interesting with the clay that we see a white colour and a red colour. Was it made in one coloured clay and painted in a slip, which is just powdered clay that's been dried, pulverised and powdered, mixed with a little bit of water? I use vinegar as well because it's like the magic sauce that helps things stick. Would they have used vinegar as well? Was that painted on top? So the clay is, I'm flabbergasted by the quality of the clays used. And on the small things, I'm amazed by the quality and the fineness of the clays used. They knew how to process clay. They had to have, because it doesn't necessarily come out of the ground like that. It might do, There might be some places where you can get it out of the ground like that. So, and that brings us to think that, do we want to talk about grog now, or should we do that in a minute?
Sure, go for it.
The clay I use is fairly soft and elastic. I used to use heavier clays when I had my shoulder redone. The only way I was going to be allowed to start throwing as soon as possible was to use something softer and gooier. So I sourced out softer, gooier clay. What's the difference between a softer, gooier clay and a harsher, more firm, stronger clay? Why do you need different sorts of clay? The clay I use has very little grog in it, very little grit, very little, all of the particles are tiny. To make bigger things that need more structural integrity, I would use a clay that's got a lot more grit in it, a lot more grog in it. But we also know that they ground up things like seashells and to give, because they could be made into very fine particles, or coarse particles, but they could be made to change the color of a clay. They could be used to mix with clay to make a slip. It just gives me more questions. All it gives me is questions. And that has taken me down many rabbit holes. But it is interesting that the outside is whiter and the inside is red, and but there is white on it. So is that the earth that it was found in and was in for a long
Yes,
time?
possible.
Or did they make it like that?
Right. As far as the grit or the inclusions that have been added to the clay, in my research, I found out that something that some archaeologists have done, I was horrified to learn this, they will take a potsherd and they will cut it.
No!
They will take a saw that was used for mother of pearl jewelry work, and they will take a little piece and they will slice a micro-thin piece in order to see what the inclusions are, to see what the ancient potters may have intentionally mixed into the recipe in order to achieve a consistency that will serve a different production level. So they did that.
And that will dry evenly and fire nicely.
Wow.
So
Let's look at another. We got two more.
I love that little piece because it's not an everyday thingy. It's, for the age that it is, it was made to be special. I can see that it was made to be special.
We come now to one of the most interesting shapes. I'll lift it up so all can more easily see it. We call this a pilgrim flask. Think of it as a Boy Scout canteen, able to carry beverages if you're out on the road. This one dates to 1550 to 1200, a little pre-monarchical as far as the Israelite era. Beautiful for its coloration. It's got concentric red and black coloration, which is not unusual as far as the color choices, but it makes a beautiful piece.
Very much.
We've got another of the same architecture, but it's later. It's a Roman piece. We'll put that out as well.
Oh, and this one just opens up a huge, this one makes sense. This one opens up a million questions.
When I was doing a little work on the Hebrew side of things, I found out, remember that Zarephath location between Tyre and Sidon? Well, in the text, it talks about the widow when Elijah says, before you make your last meal for yourself and your son, for they were running out of food too, he says, bring me some water and then make me some. And she said, make me a bit of bread. And she says, I only have a little bit of flour in a jar and a little bit of oil in it's one of these. The word is jug. And the linguists say it would have been this shape of a piece that she's referring to. And if you know the story, as she honored the prophet in God's direction, her little jar of flour and her little jug of oil miraculously sustained her until that condition was ended. But tell us what you see.
Immediately, this piece, I said some things earlier that I'm now rethinking about this piece.
All right.
earlier I said, can we turn it so that
by
people
all
can
means.
see how it tips?
What would you like them to see?
The spout.
The spout, right. That is most interesting.
Oh, actually, if we can look at these circly bits,
Oh,
the
right.
circly bits, this was made on a wheel. This was most certainly made on a wheel. When we look at the other side, we see it looks like it was made on a wheel. But I think they might have put a sausage of clay around here,
Wow.
almost like a foot, because there's a crack here. Do you
Sure
think?
enough, I hadn't noticed that.
Do you
I
think
hadn't
there
noticed
might
that.
be a seam
You're probably
around
right.
here? Because you can see a ring that goes all the way around. Do you think
Yeah.
that might be a seam?
Yeah.
And here, this is not even. This is not typical of a pot that was thrown, which is interesting.
Well,
Anyway, my immediate thought looking at this was, why would you make something with a spout that leans downwards? Because then you can only fill it with this much liquid, or as soon as you take the cork out, everything's gone. Now I know it was for flour.
well, actually liquid. Would
Oh,
have
was
been
it for
oil.
liquid?
Yeah, this would be the
So
one
this would
that
have been,
oil.
okay,
Yeah.
well that makes,
I may have confused you there.
still doesn't make sense. The one thing I notice immediately is I can see that where they put the handles. Oh, touched it. I can see where they put the handles on. I can see where they compressed the clay and joined them together. They would have smoothed it and smoothed it and smoothed it to put the handles on. I can see the finger marks. I can see the identity of the person that made it. That's mind blown. Anyway, would have been made on a wheel. How does this thing make sense? It would have had to have had a plug of some sort to contain what was in it, but why make it this shape? This makes sense. This makes perfect sense to me. This doesn't make any sense to me as a modern potter, because it's got a slightly conical bottom. So if you put it on something flat, it's always gonna, and it's probably gonna to the side where the heavy pieces are, where the spout and the handles are. Why would you make it like that?
So you'd almost need a strap on it and suspend it most of the time. Hang it on a peg, perhaps.
Or it wouldn't have handles.
Yeah.
But then if you were going to set it down on a sandy ground, it having a conical bottom makes a ridiculous amount of sense. And you would be able to set it evenly. So the whole pointy bottomed thing is beginning to make an awful lot of sense to me, which it didn't before.
When you were here earlier, you commented,
Oh, what
and
did I
was
say?
amazed at the stages of construction, this and then adding the spout,
Absolutely.
and then about the upper portion. Share with folks what you indicated.
The one thing I was saying, the way this would have been thrown, sometimes I can, for a particular thing, if I want to make something like pumpkin, I can throw a ball that's enclosed at the top that is full of air. The only thing that's stopping it from pancaking in on itself is the fact that it's completely self-contained and the air inside it is like a little balloon that's holding it up together. If I poke that with a pin, the air comes out, the whole thing collapses. So I could throw a ball that was enclosed at the top and enclosed at the bottom, let it dry until it was beginning to be leather hard, at which point I would have made my handles and my spout. And then I could cut the hole for the spout, let the air out. It's not going to collapse on itself because it's already leather hard. Then I can join my handles on, join my spout. I think the spout was made on a wheel. I think it was thrown as a little something separately and joined on. If we look around here, can you see where it was joined? Can you see the marks? It's almost like somebody's gone.
Right there.
It's almost
Yes.
like they've smoothed it down. So when it was leather hard and able to sustain its integrity, they would have had these other pieces at exactly the same moisture content already. This would actually have been bigger than it is. And it probably would have been cut here and laid over
All right.
and smoothed down. So that makes perfect sense to me. What did I say about the lid? Ask me the question that...
You commented on the fact that if they had not made this reinforced, stronger lip
Oh,
at
it
the
wouldn't
top,
survive.
It
Yeah,
wouldn't survive.
it wouldn't survive if you were using something that was pottery and you were putting a cork in it. And I was thinking, you know, you could make a little plug for something like this and seal it with wax for transportation if you wanted to. But if you were using this in the house every day, would you just use a cork? But if you didn't reinforce this, there's no way you could keep using it without the pressure from the cork pushing in, breaking it. So, but you want the walls to be thin enough so the item isn't so heavy that when it's full of something, you can't move it. So reinforcing the top of something, when I make a teapot that's going to have a lid, I make it with a gallery, because not only does the lid sit in or on it to hold the lid, it actually reinforces the top so that with use, it doesn't destroy itself. So, and I also was thinking that with this being reinforced, if you wanted to tie a lid on there, then the string is, you can tie the string here and the lid can hang and it's not going to pop off.
Well,
and our general habit with something like this would be, this might, I would imagine is for transport.
Yes.
I would pick this up by the neck if I were picking it up at home. I wouldn't use both handles or one handle.
Looks strong enough for that.
I would, I would the neck would be reinforced, and I would think, oh, that's strong enough for me to pick it up by the neck. And also, my hands aren't going to slip off of it because it's because it curves outwards. So those are just thoughts from me now. My enjoyment of this piece is as a thrower of pottery on the wheel, symmetry is very important to me. I don't like any of my things to be wonky. If I am taking something off the wheel and moving it while it's still, when I've just thrown it, and I lose a bit of my symmetry and it goes a bit wonky, I'll think, oh, I can't sell that. I mean, I can, because people don't care. It's made by hand. But I want it to be symmetrical. This bothers me. This bothers me because of the way we live now, because it has symmetry this way, but it doesn't have symmetry this way, and this one does everywhere.
You know, your comment about it going wonky and you can't sell it reminds me of, there was a place, and some of you may be thinking of the passage I'm going to, where God said to Jeremiah, go to the potter's house. And he went to the potter's house, and as we read the passage, it says, and the potter was there at his wheel. Isn't that remarkable? And then he goes on to be making something, and it doesn't turn out right. And so he discards it. And this becomes a message from God to say, cannot I, as the potter, remake you? So you talk about pieces that kind of fall apart, and you
it
kind
happens.
of rework it.
And there are times when I'll be sitting at the wheel yelling at the clay, I am the potter. I will have pieces of clay that just seem to be difficult, especially if I've reprocessed my clay. I don't throw anything away. If I have something that goes cattywampus, I'll set it aside. It dries until I can grind it into a powder, and then I'll reconstitute it, make it into clay again. When I reprocess my clay, often it will be a bit lumpy, and if I try and throw with it, having tried to cut corners and haven't processed it quite as nicely as I should have done, it won't throw nicely, and I can't get the symmetry that I want. Interesting.
Well, the last piece is not the one that I'm holding here, but this might be useful as illustration for that idea of coil construction. The last piece is actually over here to my left. This is known as a collared rim Canaanite jar. It was a characteristic piece of Palestine. It was used in massive quantities for transporting either oil or wine exports. It was also used in the home. Sometimes they would bury them so that they would be down at the floor level. If you go to Masada, for example, on one of the plazas, you'll see holes in the ground of the fortress, and actually underneath there is a cavity where they would store, in that case, probably grain. So a collared rim jar, the collard rim refers to the flare at the top, as opposed to something like this.
Has no
This
collar.
is the whole mouth jar, and you can see there's no flare to it. This is Persian era, so think in terms of Daniel, maybe what, 500 BC, something like that, as opposed to the colored rim jar. Let's see, we're suggesting this would be 1200 to 586. 586, the fall of Jerusalem. So a long span of time that was used. So I'm going to get a bit out of the way so that you can see this better. And what goes through your mind with a piece of...
With this one or this one?
Primarily this.
This one? This one, I think was made with coils. I think it was made with long sausages that were rolled out and coiled around on top of each other and then maybe smoothed down. I could be completely wrong about that, but I don't think this looks like it was thrown on a wheel. I think we can see lines that suggest that it was made with coils. And then I think, I'm not sure I would ever construct something with a top like this, because unless I made my top, again, separately, let them both dry a little bit, then joined it together. It looks like it's been joined, but then the whole thing has been joined because it's been made with coils. What was it used for, and why didn't it need a neck? And I still, so much of what I do now hasn't changed at all from when these things were made. I made a coil pot the other day because I haven't made one for years and years and years. And I didn't do anything different from what they would have done to make this. Nothing. I laid my coils down, smoothed them up. Where is it? Coil pot.
Is that right? Well,
it's a bit heavy.
By the way, as far as what
you wouldn't want to use it.
The charring on the bottom suggests
it was for cooking.
This was probably used for a stew.
Yeah. And it would have been set into the fire.
Right. Right. Think of Jacob and Esau. Jacob's been cooking. Esau comes up and Jacob's got a vegetable stew cooking. It might have been in a pot, although this is Persian era, much later. Might have been something like
so
that.
Does it not need a spout? Because while it's that hot, you're not going to move it. Yeah. And does it not need a spout because you're going to dip into it to take the hot soup out? And it's going to stay there in the fire to stay warm.
How about this one? You were
this
telling
one...
us what it takes to make one of these.
This one, I've really struggled with this because when you see this, this has a pointy bottom as well, right? All the way down to a point. And there were many things I didn't understand about making a pointy bottom because we just wouldn't do that now unless it was for display. And I make mainly functional pottery. The thing that has miffed me a little bit about this, when potters want to make something big, you can only throw really a pot that's as tall as your arm is long. Generally, men throw bigger pots very, very well. One, because they can handle the weight and they have the upper body strength to deal with a large piece of clay and the weight of the clay. The sort of clay used to make something big like this would have to be a heftier clay, a more groggy clay so that it can support its weight. I couldn't use soft elastic clay with not much grog in it to make something this big. As I built it up, it just would not support itself. So this had to have been, and you can almost see little bits of grit and little pock marks where the grog is. And now I want to know what sort of grog they used. What was it? Was it seashells? Was it sand? Was it sand that had been ground so that it was fine? What was it? And all I've ended up with here is so many more questions than I've ended up with answers. And it's glorious. It's wonderful. So with this, my immediate thought with this, because it's so lovely and smooth, it's got some pitting on it. I would imagine that's from age and from where it was found, maybe.
Okay, sure.
My immediate thought with this was, it's symmetrical, it's beautiful, it was thrown on a wheel. Then my thought was, well, hold on a minute. This is really big. Who has arms long enough to throw something this big? Which led me to think I know a couple of potters that do throw large things. And what they do is they'll throw the base, set it aside, throw not a cone, a cylinder, bottomless cylinder, set it aside, throw a top, collar it in. I still call this collaring in when I make my rims today. That's what we call it, collaring in. I would collar it in. Then when they're all that leathery hard stage, which means they're a bit stronger, we can join all the pieces together. That is still done. I know of a potter that makes things that are maybe 5 or 6 feet tall. They're all thrown, but they're not thrown in one piece, and they never could be. There's not, we don't know a way to do it. We haven't moved on that much in our craft. So, and the way the top curves out, again, that makes me think, would there have been a pottery lid for this that was fixed on or tied on? Or what else did I say that you're...
You've got great questions, but I would remember...
Too many questions, not enough answers.
By the force and skill required to make something of that dimension, instead of just seeing it as a static piece. To think
and that leads us to wonder if, was it made with coils? The thickness of it makes me think no. No, it was thrown. And it was thrown in sections. The next one, well I don't know
why don't we shift
what we
to
think.
Q&A?
Sorry, so we have more questions, but it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you for the insight.
I'm probably not going to have very many useful answers.
As this has been unfolding, I trust the sense of actual potters, and I love your comments about, you can see the fingerprints.
That's
We can see the individuals as they were putting these together. Any questions that have come to your mind that you'd like to pose to Julie? Yes, back, Tom.
Would they have used earth firing?
When you say earth firing, do you mean pit firing?
Yes.
Yeah, we still use pit firing today. It's possible to get the temperatures needed for pit firing. And a lot of the times when we pit fire today, we do it, and this is something that hasn't changed for hundreds and hundreds of years. We might wrap a wire around a pot when we pit fire, or a particular type of vegetation, and wrap it in newspaper. As it fires and those items fire away, they leave different colors and different designs on the pot. So we still pit fire today. There are potters that exclusively pit fire. That's their craft. So my guess is that at the beginning, they would have found out that they could fire things by lining their fire pit with clay, building a fire in it, and actually at the end of it thinking, oh, this is a thing. We could put something in these things.
In fact, archaeologists have found that the first ones were sunken in the earth, and then later they built up kilns of different sorts that were
right. And
understanding the question.
The town that you were saying has all of the kilns.
Yes,
my thought with that was, how big are those kilns? Do we know the sizes?
I don't, but I'm sure the archaeologists could give us information. I wonder, any of my colleagues here, do you have any information on kiln sizes?
I know in England we still have kilns. A couple of the pottery centres that are ancient pottery centres that still run the way they did hundreds of years ago. The kilns are a big conical building, and they'll take 2,000 or 3,000 of something this big, and everything will get stacked. It'll be packed with wood, vented in certain places, and fire for 3 or 4 days. Somebody will sleep there by the kiln. The fire will be kept going. The right temperatures will be reached. And we kind of can know. Now it's all a lot more technical. I fire in a bit of an old-fashioned way. I haven't got a lovely digital kiln. But I'm wondering if a lot of the times when they fired, I'm not sure if the things that they pit fired would reach a temperature where they glow. When we kiln fire, we can peek inside. My kiln today has plugs that can go in and take plug out, peek inside from a distance away because I like to have eyebrows. I have melted my mascara peeking into my kiln a little closely. But I can peek in there and think, oh, this is great. I can turn the kiln off now and this can cool down naturally because everything's glowing red, orange, yellow. All of the items I fire will glow like they're about to melt, but obviously they don't because they're clay. So yes, I think that they would have started by pit firing, and yes, it is something we still do today, and they would have just figured out that there was easier ways to do that in larger amounts. And that makes me think about the way they still cook pig in the ground in pit fires, and that would be very nice right now.
Great question. Move on, catch another question. Anyone else? Yes. Laura.
I'm just questioning the practicality of the big one. It looks awfully heavy and awkward to transport, especially if it were full.
Yes. Well, evidently, so the question was, what's the practicality of the big one, and is it possible to move it, transport it when it's full? Evidently, they didn't see that as an issue, and what I'm calling to mind, there's a shipwreck that dates to around 1500 BC. It's in a region called Ulbarun off of the southwest Turkish coast, 1500 BC. What divers have found there, if my memory serves me correctly, is about 100 of these, and they were filled with a sort of turpentine. So a mastic, some of it was used in the mummification process, an export product. The fact that we find so many in one shipwreck gives us the notion that evidently they were comfortable with using this as a major piece of containerized cargo, I guess is what we might.
And you were telling me that the ones with the pointed bottoms were often nestled in ballast at the bottom of a ship.
Yeah, and that would be true for a piece that we didn't bring up here, but there's a torpedo form one. On your way out, you might want to look at the far back right case, the bottom layer. There's a torpedo form. It would look like this one, but about 3 times longer and a little more slender. Yes, that has a much narrower profile.
And handles.
And little handles up at the top, you'll see there, and we are told that probably that nested down into ballast in the ship. The shape of the side of the vessel would have been appropriate for the shape of the containers. And indeed, that's what we found from the shipwrecks, this kind, but also the smaller ones.
Something I'm thinking about with the large one, the fact that it hasn't got handles, it probably wasn't meant to be moved, and I'm wondering if it would have been buried in the ground.
I think somewhat.
And if that was buried in sand and you were to keep that sand moist, it would keep it cold. It would keep it very cold. So could it have been a water cistern? Could it have been for keeping water?
Could certainly
wine?
Yes.
Could it?
Wine,
so
oil.
it might have been made to not move.
It's possible.
Ever.
Some were stationary.
Yeah.
We know that they coated the interior of some in order to make them impervious to
Yeah.
flow.
Oh, and that's something that I've found out since being here. It was really interesting because the oil lamps were bothering me greatly. Because if I fired something and a glaze has crazed or cracked a little bit, it still looks lovely, but I can't put a liquid inside it because it will gently bleed out. And the oil lamps, the little ones, were really bothering me because I thought, how would we put oil in these and it wouldn't just gently over time bleed through. Maybe that's why they're so small, because then you use up all the oil each time. And I ended up, it bothered me so badly, I ended up phoning the company that make my clay, and they put me in contact with somebody in California who's a clay chemist, physicist, I don't know what you would call him. And now I'm in possession of 50 pounds of clay that you can make lamps out of that won't leak. So there are different types of clay for different things, and they would have kind of accidentally found that out along the way, my guess is. So now I can make lamps that aren't clays that won't leak. So should I need some? So interesting.
Well, I'm going to suggest if you have additional questions, come and pose them at this time. Let's express our appreciation to her, and then we'll move this table out of the way and switch to a demonstration. Join me in thanking you.
So the first thing that has to be done is the clay has to be in the middle of the wheel. If we don't get the clay in the middle of the wheel as we make it into something, we wobble a bit, and then we end up with one side of the vessel that's very, very thick, other side of the vessel is very, very thin. As it dries, it destroys itself. So it's very, very important. And as a potter, the first thing you will want to learn is how to get the clay into the middle of the wheel. And this took me about 6 weeks of blob of clay on the wheel, trying to get it in the middle, throwing it at the wall. Blob of clay in the middle of the wheel, trying to get it in the middle, throw it at the wall. This is the hardest part. If you can do this and get a piece of clay into the middle of a wheel, you're at least halfway to where you need to be. So we're going to cone up, we're going to cone down. My little bit of clay here is a bit bigger than I need. So what I was going to reproduce was the little raised chalice. The photo I had made it look a bit shorter and not quite so deep. So I saw the one here again today and I was just like, oh yeah, I didn't make that quite right. So we'll make the base first. Normally when we're going to throw a vessel, as we push down into the middle of the clay, we're not looking to push all the way through to the wheel because we want whatever it is to have a base in it. So normally we'll push through. I'll use a needle to push into the middle, see how deep the bottom is. When I feel like the bottom's just about the right depth, I'll start to pull up my walls. Because we're making something that pretty much is a candlestick, I don't know where I put it, go down into the center. For this, I am going all the way down to the bottom, which seems really, really wrong, because I don't normally do that. Then I'll pull out. And it's really important for me to manage to keep this all centered whilst doing other things to it. Everything we make on the pottery wheel starts its life as, I always want to say cone, that's not the right word, as a cylinder. There we go. Who said cylinder? Right word. Everything we make starts as a cylinder. It doesn't matter if I'm making a bowl, doesn't matter if I'm making a cup, doesn't matter if I'm making a vase, doesn't matter. Everything we make, what we teach our students is to pull up a cylinder, because then we can teach them. What we teach them is we teach them to measure the bottom thickness, pull up the walls of the cylinder, and then I'll go around and chop everybody's vessels in half, break their hearts, and show them how important it is to have the walls the same thickness as the bottom, because if they're not, when it dries we get big S cracks in the bottom. So what we want is, we want a cylinder. Once we've got the cylinder, I can make it into anything I want. I can belly it out, I can take it in, I can put a flat ridge. I like very mid-century modern shapes where it's very bellied and then it suddenly goes in, and then we have a nice, you know, a nice fluted top on it or something. We can make it into any shape we want. What we're going to do with this one is, sorry, all my toys have ended up in the wrong thing because My water bucket's got stuck together. I should have a pin here somewhere. Something else I was thinking about pointing out was I use tools now that are the same as the tools they would have used then. These are all called ribs. It doesn't really matter what shape they are. I use exactly the same things now that they would have used. It hasn't changed. Some of my tools might be made of metal now, but they're no different. They're exactly the same thing. So there's some tooly things here. Sorry, haven't got my pin. We're going to cheat and use this. I'm going to make this a little bit shorter and get rid of that. But that's something else that I was thinking while we were looking at all these things, was nothing's changed. They were brilliant. They were absolutely brilliant. What they would have done is to put a plate on top of this, which is all the top of that is, it's a little dish. If I stuck a dish on top of this, the minute it began to dry or the minute I moved it, it would fall off. There's no support. So what they would have done, and if you look at the underneath of that, they made a little, they would have made a little platform. It's slightly conical and concave, so that when I put the dish on it, the dish just kind of is nested in there. So we can make this any shape and size we want. We trim a bit off the bottom. Actually looks nice like that with a little bit of a... There we go. It's that simple. It's that, and that makes me think, when they were making things, you know, when I produce things, I never throw less than 10 things at a time. Normally by then my back is telling me that my body needs a cup of coffee. But this is what we would have done. They would probably have had something like a sea sponge, or a squashy, smushy, wet holding thing of some description to clean things up with. It's very hard for me not to put all sorts of ridges and doodads on this. We would have cleaned that up so we have to do as least work as possible to it later on.